You've been watching the documentary Big Healthy Life by local filmmaker Chris Schuler. I'm joined now in studio by one of the experts in that film, Patty Keene. She's a registered dietitian and associate scientist at the UNM Prevention Research Center. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate you being here. Now, the film mentions that New Mexico ranks #2 in the nation for childhood food insecurity. What does that mean exactly? It's a term we hear a lot. What does that mean?
We do hear it a lot, and we used to hear it a little bit differently. We used to hear it more referred to as hunger. Right?
Okay.
And you can thank epidemiologists who basically came and said, you know, we really can't call it hunger because hunger is an individual physiological condition. And the way the United States measures food insecurity is at the household level. So what they're talking about really is, and there's 4 levels. So there's high food security, marginal food security, and then food insecurity and low food security, right. Excuse me. And those correlate with how does that food security level in that household manifest. So when we talk about, really we lump together low food security and very low food security together, often in that measure. But basically what that means is that in the household there's not adequate access, there's not confidence that there's going to be access in that food. And when we talk about very low food security, that additionally means that people are changing their eating behaviors. So they're reducing the amount of food that they're taking in. They're not eating their culturally appropriate foods, right? The traditional foods that they might be used to. So that's sort of the academic sort of description of it and definition. And taking out the hunger part of that terminology was challenging on the advocacy side, right? Because it doesn't resonate the same way. Right. When you talk about low food security and very low food security, it doesn't resonate the same way for people as hunger does. So when we look at sort of the literature and the statistics, it's important to understand what those differentiations are, but certainly to recognize that what that means is that individual people, New Mexicans, children, seniors, veterans are experiencing hunger physically, right? And the health impacts and all the other impacts.
I appreciate that length of that description because it is a confusing term for a lot of folks. Another term that we talk about here a lot at New Mexico PBS is food deserts, and particularly for rural folks in our state. So fruits and veggies, of course, is the goal here. What happens for folks in rural parts of our state who may not have access to readily available fruits and veggies just down the road as we take for granted in the city sometimes?
Right. So lots of different strategies for managing that, right? So some of it can be going to larger stores once a month and stocking up in that way. We don't, from a nutrition standpoint, we certainly want to encourage fresh fruits and vegetables. We know that that's, supportive of the local economy, but we also don't want to necessarily demonize canned fruits and vegetables, frozen fruits and vegetables. That's really important in these conversations to recognize that for some, that is all that they can access. And so that's an important thing, I think, to keep in mind too. Certainly and I do a lot of work in rural New Mexico, for many of the families that we work with in communities that we're in, they need to drive 50 miles to a grocery store. So they do rely on those smaller gas station, convenience store type, Dollar General, the dollar type stores. They do rely on those for that kind of access. And certainly, urban areas have food deserts too. In a lot of pockets in the city, we have those. But in the rural piece is not only impactful for individual families, but certainly for kids. It also it puts a lot of burden on schools. When we talk about trying to get fresh foods into the school system, smaller rural, particularly smaller Head Starts and those types of institutions have a much harder time getting purveyors to be willing to drive that distance. So it comes on the other side of that food chain too.
I could see that too. I could see that. That's interesting. One of the things that came up in the doc that I think a lot of us can relate to is there's 2 big problems for a lot of families. That is time and also money. Kind of taking those 2 things at a time, 2 things separately. If you don't have a lot of time for preparation, all that kind of thing, but you do need to get kids fed and get out the door, sometimes the unhealthy option is the better time option.
Sure.
And that's a difficulty. How do we get around that?
So what we really know is, first and foremost, the way to save money, all of us should be doing this, right? Is planning.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily learning that in school anymore. We used to learn it in home ec. We're not doing that anymore.
Right.
And so that's one of the things, and one of the programs that I run is a SNAP-Ed funded program in the state. There's lots of SNAP-Ed programming in the state of New Mexico. New Mexico State University runs their big ICANN program. And that's really about empowering families with those skills. And it's the things that maybe we used to learn in home ec or somewhere else or from our families, but for whatever reason, a lot of those skills and that knowledge isn't necessarily being passed down.
Right.
So it's, okay, how do I make a shopping list and stick to it? I mean, it sounds really boring and sounds basic, but for a lot of us, that is sort of the gateway to, okay, I can do this, right? And I can stick to my budget. We do a lot of that planning with families, and actually we did an activity with them to show that you may save time, but you're actually not necessarily saving that much money by going through the fast food line, for example, right? If you recreate that same exact meal at home, you actually will save a lot more money, and you can even still save money if you even make that meal healthier by kind of aligning it more with dietary guidelines and having more fruits and vegetables and things like that. So a lot of it really is the educational piece to do that for families. If people have online access, there's loads of good resources, particularly at USDA's website, myplate.gov, and also the SNAP-Ed connection, which I can send those links so that you have them.
We'll have them up on our website, absolutely. Another resource that I have found in cooking in bulk is another challenge for people. YouTube is an absolute gold mine for how to cook in bulk. It's amazing how many people are doing this online. I do have a question about, the reality is a lot of our folks do have to eat from places like Roadrunner, in pantries, and it's just a reality we deal with. What's your sense of the kind of food and nutrition folks are getting in those environments? Is it good nutrition? Is it something just stopgap, or how does that work?
So, and full disclosure, I'm on the board for Roadrunner Food Bank. So Roadrunner has really done extensive, really innovative work in supporting fresher foods, healthier foods. They're piloting lots of different programs around the state, providing fresh fruits and vegetables at the mobile food pantries in particular, as well as their brick and mortar food pantry partners. Traditionally, food pantry packages are are inadequate in a lot of the nutrients of concern that we have, particularly for children. But that's coming along. But that is that you could do a whole show on that, because when we really talk about who's the population that they're serving, right? Low-income, food insecure families and individuals. When we're talking about serving that population is at higher risk for chronic disease, nutrition-related chronic disease. So there's this sort of food insecurity and chronic disease cycle that's pretty well documented in academic literature, and there's lots of research being done in that area too, to basically develop that evidence so that then we can develop better interventions. And then also, but some of that too, there's a big mind shift that would need to happen, because there's a long-standing perception that, well, we just need to give them calories if they're hungry.
I could imagine. I can't thank you enough for coming in. It's a big subject for New Mexico. It's a huge subject, and thank you for all the work you're doing with this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now let's head back into the film now. We finish up with Big Healthy Life with a section on exercise and how to help families put their best foot forward.